I want to jump straight away now to Jacobson's, and I'll try not to read so much now. Jacobson's poetic function. And as many of you will know, in Jacobson's famous paper of 1960, Linguistics and Poetics, final statement, he argued that there are these different functions in language, and where in poetry the poetic function is dominant, and what that means is that somehow the signs are much more palpable, there's a focus on the message for the message's own sake, and the projection of equivalence is crucial. The poetic function projects the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection, the paradigm, all the possible terms you could have used, into the syntam, the axis of combination, so that, as it were, things that are rivals and unrelated, simply part of the axis of selection, are yoked together, and a more than ordinary equivalence is locally claimed or projected. And as Derek Attridge said about Jacobsonian structuralism of this kind, terribly old-fashioned in a sense, but still terribly usable. And I bear in mind that Attridge is a great champion of Jacobson as well as a great champion of Derrida, Derek Attridge, the English professor. It seems to me very helpful to think of poetic discourse as a discourse in which the reader is encouraged by the text itself and by the cultural matrix within which it is presented to derive meaning, let us leave that word as vague as we can, from a number of linguistic features over and above the usual operations of lexis and syntax. So in a way I'm trying to look at what some of these linguistic features might be. Attridge himself, in a rather fine book called The Singularity of Literature, identifies creativity as just one of the three desiderata of art, and in fact in a hierarchy where the most important of these three is invention. Creativity is just for him making new things. Originality is making new things which challenge the immediate socio-historical culture. Invention is making things which are new, which are so challenging that they continue to challenge regardless of shift over time and as it were, space. They continue to be new. They don't, as it were, their sort of challengingness to the environment does not fade with time. So, to me, Jacobson's projection of equivalence is a highfalutin way of talking about repetition. I think everything that Jacobson focuses on in that paper in terms of pattern is rooted in repetition. But then for me, pattern is rooted in repetition. A pattern involves repetition. Without repetition of some sort, there would be no pattern. Repetition for me is also crucial to literary works in at least two senses. The external sense that the literary text must bear rereading many times over without, as it were, being used up, without wearing out. Reinterpreting, of course, in the rereading. And in the more, for me, the internal sense I want to focus on, that it tends to exploit within itself more more repetition than any other kind of text known to me. So for these reasons, I want to say repetition may be one of the crucial defining characteristics of literature. Literature exploits and privileges repetition, kinds of repetition, or repetitions with kinds of difference, but repetitions all the same. Even in its invention, the literary text is oriented to repetition. That is, to inventively casting a following phrase or line as echoically linkable to a previous one, thereby achieving, over and over again, a focusing and depth of texture, again atypical in non-literary discourse. The achieving of depth of that kind logically follows from this saying more about one focused upon thing or set of things, rather than shifting the attention to something thoroughly new. One might even say that three expectations commonly held about most literary texts: that they will be relatively individually autonomous, along with standard text coherence expectations of completeness and some degree of perceived unity, that when you take these three things together, they require a variety of forms of repetition. I had some discussion also in here, but I won't explore it now, about why should repetition be so powerful? And for me, it ties in very much with the communicating of understanding or the communicating of attention. Whatever someone says to you, how can you convey to them that you have understood what they've said? I had one little scenario, perhaps I'll try and run it by you if I can find the right page. Yes, here we go. Think of the canonical speech situation. People face to face, physically contiguous, no barriers to hearing or seeing. The only utterance that B can produce in reply to A's initial utterance, so as to leave A reasonably confident that B has recognized and understood what A has said, is something close enough to A's utterance to be deemed a repetition. I wonder if that is why, in the old checking systems on the bridge of a ship or the flight deck of a plane, in the movies at least, the second officer's remarks are extensive repeats of the first officer's. A orders, 15 degrees to starboard, reduce speed to 10 knots, and B responds, 15 degrees to starboard, reduce speed to 10 knots. B's being able to repeat A's utterance isn't the whole story, but it is certainly the beginning of a demonstrated understanding. Whereas if A says 15 degrees to starboard, reduce speed to 10 knots, and B says, no problem, or says, your wish is my command, A cannot be sure that B has attended to all and only what A has said. B may be saying that running out to get A cappuccino is no problem. Or he may have understood and be responding to the reduced speed order, but may have missed the change direction order. As teachers and parents, we know all this. We know that when communicational understanding and compliance get sticky, one useful first strategy is to ask the pupil or the child, what did I just say? And I could go on a bit more about that, but I might get repetitive. Let me move on to my texts. Of course, repetition is not the whole story, and things like metaphor are very hard to fit into this picture. But I do think repetition is, in a way, a kind of a reworking of the Jacobsonian focus on equivalence. Nor do I mean absolute duplication. I take the liberty of saying that by repetition I mean something like interpretively resemblant forms or segments of any kind, including rhymes and visual patterning. Now the question comes, are there good repetitions and bad repetitions? Surely not all kinds of repetitions are okay, and my short answer is yes, there seem to be differences. If we look now at the handout, Seamus Heaney poem, and later the McGonagall poem, I'll quickly read the Seamus Heaney poem for you in the few minutes I've got. A poem about St. Kevin, who's praying in the remote place with his hands stretched out, and as he prays, a blackbird lands on his hand, and being a St. Francis kind of a guy, he's not just going to... He's in the ecology. And so the blackbird settles and forms a nest, and St. Kevin feels he must not move until the bird has laid her eggs, the eggs have hatched and the birds have flown away. And that's as it were, the pretext for Seamus Heaney's poem, which is as follows. And then there was St. Kevin and the blackbird. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out inside his cell, but his cell is narrow, so one turned up palm is out the window, stiff as a crossbeam, when a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tucked neat head and claws, and, finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks, until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. And since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, imagine being Kevin. Which is he? Self-forgetful or in agony all the time, from the neck on out down through his hurting forearms? Are his fingers sleeping? Does he still feel his knees? Or has the shut-eyed blank of under-earth crept up through him? Is there distance in his head? Alone and mirrored clear in love's deep river, to labour and not to seek reward, he prays. A prayer his body makes entirely, for he has forgotten self, forgotten bird, and on the riverbank, forgotten the river's name.